Hello and welcome back to Solomon's Cave. This is, for now, the final video on Hebrew accents and the Qamets. Let me briefly review what we've seen so far about these two topics. For accents, I've introduced you to the Siluk and Sof Pasuk, marking the end of a verse, the Athnach, often breaking verses in two, and the Zakev, the Sakolta, and the Rabia, breaking up verses and sentences in even smaller pieces, primarily intended to assist in the reading out loud of the text. Then the Qamets. In the video on Hebrew vowels, I introduced you to the fact that the Qamets can be either a long A sound or a short O sound. Then later, I made a dedicated video on how to distinguish between the two, and I gave you 3 rules. 1. Assume it is a normal Qamets. 2. Unless it is right before a Chatef Qamets. 3. Unless it is in a closed syllable. Now I will add one more rule to this, and it's an exception to rule number 3. A Qamets is a Qamets Chatuf if it is in a closed syllable, unless the closed syllable has an accent. This is what every Hebrew grammar tells you. They will say something like, a Qamets is a Qamets Chatuf if it is in a closed, unaccented syllable. But here's what they almost never tell you. Which accents? Biblical Hebrew is loaded with accents. Almost every Hebrew word has at least one accent, and often they even have more. And they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. The 5 accents I've discussed before are just the tip of the iceberg, and there is no way of knowing, from this brief statement, which accents you're supposed to keep an eye out for when it comes to distinguishing so-called accented and unaccented closed syllables, for distinguishing the Qamets. For this question, I had to delve deep into various grammars, and here is what I found. There are several accents specifically dedicated to marking stress or emphasis, including a generic one you'll find in grammars, vocabulary lists, and verb paradigms. And you also have to keep an eye out for stress or emphasis. Let's actually start with the last one, and it will make the use of the other accents clear. Like English, Hebrew words are pronounced with a particular stress. What I mean is that for words with multiple syllables, usually one of those syllables gets the stress or the emphasis. Just listen to the difference between emphasis, emphasis, and emphasis. If you're a native or fluent speaker of a language, you often don't think about this anymore. You do it automatically, and you probably aren't even aware of the rules that govern which syllables are emphasized. But for a new language, especially one that's no longer spoken, you sometimes have to learn those rules. So what's the rule in Biblical Hebrew? The first rule is that the last syllable gets the emphasis, unless otherwise noted. And getting the stress or getting the emphasis in this sense counts as being accented. So a closed syllable at the end of a word, even if there is no accent, is called accented. Very confusing, but that's the rule. So if you see a word like dabar, you will see that the first syllable is open. So the first qamets is a normal qamets. The second syllable is closed. So you think it's a qamets chatuf. But no, it is accented because it is the last syllable, and the last syllable gets the stress and is thus accented, even if there is no accent. And so it is also a normal qamets. Hence you say dabar and not dabor. Now let's get back to the written accents. We've already seen a few accents, and besides the function I've already described, they also mark the accent or stressed vowel, especially if it isn't the last one. So if you see a siluk or an athnach under a syllable that is not the final syllable, you know that that syllable has the stress. If it also happens to be a closed syllable with a qamets underneath, it is now an accented qamets, and thus not a qamets chatuf, but a normal qamets. The same is true for the zakev and the rabia. The sakolta is already on the final syllable, so you can basically ignore that one. Besides those, you may find the following accents placed under or above closed syllables to mark them as having the stress. The metek, a vertical line under the letter. the tifcha, a counterclockwise tilted opening parenthesis under the letter. Geresh, a clockwise tilted opening parenthesis above the letter. Merecha, a clockwise tilted closing parenthesis under the letter. Munach, a mirrored L under the letter. Mehupach, a smaller than sign under the letter. And the second pashta, a counterclockwise tilted closing parenthesis above the letter. Note, if there is one pashta, it is always above the last letter. If there are two, one is above the last letter, the other is above the stressed syllable. Because there are so many different accents in the ancient manuscripts, and since the choice on which accent to use depends heavily on context, Hebraists invented their own accent to be used in vocabulary lists and grammars. It looks like a smaller than symbol and is placed above the accented or stressed syllable. Here's an example of what I mean. In Genesis 1 verse 1, the word heaven, shamayim, looks like this, with a small tifcha under the ma. In some fonts, like the printed BHS, it looks more like a backward slash. Then in Genesis 1 verse 8, it happens to be the word that receives the athnach, which more or less divides the verse in two. And then in the next verse, shamayim gets two pashtas, one on the final letter and the other one on the ma syllable again. So in order to avoid all that complexity, vocab lists, grammars and dictionaries instead put the smaller than sign above the ma. But keep in mind that for the vast majority of Hebrew words, the emphasis is on the final syllable, and for the few vocabulary words and conjugations where that isn't the case, you'll pick up on those naturally as you go, and these accents are only there to help clarify just in case. This brings the discussion of the qamets to a close, but just as a final reminder: 1. Assume a normal qamets. 2. Unless it is before a chatef qamets. 3. Or unless it is in a closed syllable. 4. That does not have the emphasis or an accent. 5. Unless it is kol. Yes, of course Hebrew had to sneak in another exception. You would expect this to be kal, because it only has one syllable, and hence it's the last one, and hence it gets the stress. And since it is closed and accented, it should be a long qamets. But nope, this is an exception. The next Hebrew video will be about the semi-separable preposition min.